Mrs. Min placed her hand over Wyan's hand and smiled. She looked at her and saw a tear rolling down her cheek. Mrs. Min cupped her cheek and wiped away the tear gently. She explained, looking at her. Mrs. Min nodded her head. Wine stared at her, not knowing what to reply. Wine looked at her, surprised. She never knew that her feelings were that visible. Mrs. Min smiled at her. Wine shook her head at her words. She mumbled sadly. She sat, caressing her hair lovingly. Vi nodded her head. Mrs. Min was right. Maybe it was destiny. She just hoped that everything would turn out fine. After all, she still had hope. Jungkook signed the last file and glanced at the time. He smiled a little at the thought of Eunhee. All he wanted to marry her as soon as possible. Mrs. Jun asked when she placed a cup of coffee on the table and sat on the couch. He complained, she stated while smiling a little. He groaned, rubbing his temple. Mrs. Jun looked down sadly. Jungwon was adopted by Mr. Jun when he was 5 years old. He was older than Jungkook. When he became the part of the family, Mrs. Jun was pregnant with Jungkook. She said, try to reassure him. He said, looking up and meeting Mrs. Jun's gaze. Jungkook nodded at her word, making her heart clench more. She asked, walking down the hallway. The other women stopped what they were doing to look at her. Mrs. Min nodded. She was nervous about today as Jungkook and his family were coming to talk about Ryan and Jungkook wedding. Mrs. Min nodded her head. said the head caretaker of the mansion. She said everyone agreed. After that, they all went to their separate ways. Vine clenched her dress, sitting in front of Jungkook, whose gaze was stuck on her, making her nervous and anxious. He smiled to see his effect on her, which made him somehow proud of himself. He started talking, and everyone nodded their head, listening carefully. He said, making Mr. Jun chuckle. Before they continued, Jungkook spoke. He asked, looking back at him. Mr. Min nodded his head, agreeing with Mr. Jun. Vine sighed and got up as Mrs. Min nodded her head at her. She started walking while Jungkook followed her. As soon as Vine stepped inside the terrace, Jungkook immediately back hugged her. Catching her off guard, he buried his face on her crook of her neck, inhaling her scent. Vine closed her eyes at the sudden sensation. Her breath went uneven. Vine opened her eyes when he called her by her twin name. Everything went blurry inside her mind, and she tried to make the distance. Jungkook noticed her struggles and loosened his grip. He asked as he saw her pale face, which she was hiding. She couldn't continue. Vine gulped. She felt bad. This should have been Jungkook's moment with Eunhee. She sighed and looked away. She couldn't see the love which Jungkook held for Eunhee in his eyes. He asked gently, touching her arm. Jungkook tied his head and frowned his eyebrow. She sighed deeply and turned to meet his eyes. Tear popped in her eyes, which fell. Jungkook wiped away the tear with his thumbs. Vine let out an audible chuckle. How can she be happy with this marriage? After all, this was not for her. But how could she tell him this? He sat and caressed her cheek lovingly. Vine looked up at him. He seemed so understanding. She said in a shaky voice when she saw her mother standing in the doorway. Her mother smiled and walked out of there before Jungkook could see her. Jungkook smiled at her and hugged her tightly. Vine sighed and relaxed in his hold. Hugging him back, Jungkook pulled away slowly, seeing her face. She didn't look very happy. She looked down instead of him. He cupped her cheek gently, forcing her to raise her face. He smiled softly. He inquired. He didn't expect such an answer from her. She sighed deeply. She looked at him with her big, watery eyes. He leaned forward, captured her lip with his. leaving her in a shock. Her body froze, and she was stunned by his movement. Jungkook placed his one hand behind her neck and the other on her waist, pulling her close to him, deepening the kiss. She didn't kiss him back nor move away, she just stood frozen. She couldn't believe he kissed her. Jungkook broke the kiss and stared at her deeply. He whispered as he rubbed her cheek slowly with his thumb. He needed the confirmation of if she loved him or not. When he received her small nod, he gave her a sweet smile before leaning in to capture her lip again with his. This time, however, the kiss wasn't gentle but hot. Vine was confused if she was doing right or wrong. She closed her eyes and returned his kiss. It was like both of them know what they were doing. The kisses deepened. It took Vian's breath away. They separated and they both were breathing heavily, their faces close together and staring deeply into each other's eyes. She said, breaking eye contact as she started trembling slightly. Jungkook smirked at her nervous reaction. He nodded his head and Vian left without saying anything further. Jungkook wondered. Mrs. June hugged Vian happily on her decision. Mrs. June always loved Vian and wanted her to be Jungkook's wife because she always thought Vian was the perfect match for Jungkook. Mrs. June would be lying though if she said she wasn't scared because she knew the future. Scared that Jungkook wouldn't be happy, she had known that Jungkook loved Eunhee and one day he'll find out the truth, but still she chose Vian over her own son. Vian nodded and smiled forcefully. She sat and hugged Vian.